All right, we're recording. So recently wrote up an article called "Maximizing Skill Development: The Role of Fitness in Environment and Performance Progression." And so really kind of the light bulb for the article was based on my own mountain biking. So this season specifically, I've hit a fairly large progression jump in terms of like what I'm able to do and what I'm not able to do, just the fluidity of the movement and all that kind of good stuff. And just feeling way more confident on the bike. And I was curious, I'm like, sometimes I've experienced this in the past. I bet all you guys have, in terms of like you'll just be grinding at a sport for a while and then all of a sudden you're just significantly better, like by a fairly wide margin on a certain day, and you just kind of carry that over, right? It's the whatever progression worked, whatever skill development worked, and the confidence is there, all that good stuff. And like, what causes that? And are there certain things? What I was curious on most was like, is there a fitness aspect of this where we can potentially um, reduce the time to those big skill jumps? So I did a little bit of research on this, and there's just some interesting studies on this stuff in general. Some things I didn't necessarily know. So one, just in terms of the role of fitness in skill development, it was interesting. There's been quite a bit of studies on this in terms of fitness attributes trained and like what's best in order to get folks to that skill progression. So one, there's kind of an interesting difference between strength training and aerobic or conditioning training in terms of what it does to your body. So the strength training provides a hormonal response, right? IGF-1, which is good. But what really is the biggest benefit in terms of like skill progression specifically is aerobic training. And so that essentially elicits a response in brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. It's a protein that supports brain health and promotes neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is essentially I'm going to probably jam this up if a neurologist is listening, but essentially the synapse is connecting, which is essentially you learning those new skills and maintaining those new skills. So what these studies found is that both are good, but they're ideally paired together, which I think it probably is an obvious answer, but from a like physiological perspective is kind of interesting. So like the mixed training protocols of aerobic and strength training certainly are the most positively impact cognitive and skill-based performance. There's lots of research as well on kind of heart rate zone and where you want to be in terms of eliciting performance. And generally that is in that like zone 2 to 3 area. You get much higher than that, you are going to have a regression of skill application, and much lower than that, you're going to have a regression of skill application. Additionally, I looked into some of the environmental factors associated with this, since this is like particularly everything that our athletes do, whether they're tactical or mountain, is generally going to be outside. So like what do those environmental conditions do? High temperatures leading to dehydration, all that stuff, fairly obvious, right? It's gonna impair your cognitive function and reduce your performance. So I was curious. I'm like, we'll get into this in a little bit, but like, if I'm doing an uphill climb on the bike for an hour in 90-degree weather, that's obviously going to have a higher output, a higher physical output. What's required to get up the hill, right? You're burning more calories the hotter you get. And so are there ways to potentially get around that? Are there certain rules that we can build based around environmental environmental conditions in order to maximize skill application and skill development. So that's kind of like the first bulk of this. Any questions on this one?
So those environmental conditions, I mean, there's more than temperature to a day-to-day performance. You talk about how well you've been eating, your sleep that day, stress going on in your life. I like this idea of trying to identify the best environmental conditions for deliberate practice. Although I don't know that always is practical for our athletes, but I think that's an interesting idea. For example, on the strength side, the general rule is that you want to train power lifts or Olympic lifts before you train strength lifts, because the power lifts are more technically demanding, and you want to do them early in the session when you are most sharp mentally, rather than doing them later when you're fatigued. So, for example, if you are mountain biking and you want to work not only on your uphill fitness, but there's also as you know, a pretty significant technical component, just skill component, to be able to ride a mountain bike up a trail. So I think this interesting idea that if you're going to practice that, maybe you want to practice, like in your article, you said heat affected you, early in the morning or in a shady area or something like that. It's just an interesting idea in terms of when to maximize deliberate performance. The only problem with that is that I don't know how many athletes can have that luxury. You're working, Charlie. You may not be able to get out for an early morning ride. You may need to, train later in the day. Maybe that's the ideal, but you may not always be able to affect that. So go ahead. Sorry for the interruption.
Yeah, no, I'm curious if that's definitely true. And so I think part of like what I'd like to do with this is determine if there's certain rules we can establish based on some of those environmental conditions to adjust for them, right? So if I'm, let's just say, I'm just going to throw some numbers out there. On a cool day, I can burn for quite a long time at a 150 beats per minute heart rate. But do I need to potentially establish a rule if it's 90 degrees out and I'm riding at noon to lower my output? I'm not sure if that's going to be a heart rate based deal, or if that's going to be a caloric measurement in terms of, I don't want to be burning more than X amount of calories over a period of time. And if I'm like over that rate, then I need to slow down in order to most effectively develop skills or skill application.
I think we got to be careful to conflate skill and fitness in a specific sport. They're two different things. For example, let's talk about the most glaring example that I've seen in my coaching has been rock climbing. And so the novice rock climber, that person's skill is generally far behind his or her fitness. And so they can muscle their way up with sloppy technique, easy V1 or V0 boulder problems. But as they continue to improve and their skill catches up, for the most elite climbers, what you'll have is this really delicate balance between fitness and technical ability, and they'll go back and forth. Where at the highest levels, they'll be doing significant, really focused grip strength, rock specific training, dead hangs, fingerboard work, all kinds of campus board work to get their grip strong, because they'll have found that for certain climbs, their technique is there, but they can't do it physically with the strength side. And so you kind of have this delicate balance of which is in deficit for application at that time. But in general, if you are more skilled at a sport, it takes less fitness. So the better you are technically climbing uphill on your mountain bike, the less fitness it'll take, because you're not making mistakes. I've really seen this in alpine skiing, for example, where I'll be skiing behind or have skied behind one of my sponsored athletes, and at the bottom, I'll be far slower than them, and I'll be breathing a lot more than they are. And the reason is because their technical skill is so advanced, so much greater than mine, that it's much less physically demanding for them to ski than it is for me. So it's just, we have to be careful in conflating those two things. What's interesting about your article is you've seen this jump in your technical performance, right? Or have you seen the jump in your mountain biking technical performance or your fitness? I think you've noticed the technical performance, right? That's where you've seen the jump.
Yeah, I've noticed in both for sure. There's, in terms of the uphill, that's obviously, there is skill to the uphill. At least for where I'm at from a skill perspective, it's a much more fitness based deal than it is skill on the uphill. On the downhill, it's obviously, you're just going downhill. So there's still a fitness demand, but it's much less than the skill aspect of it. So I've certainly seen an improvement in both. But it was just, what really kind of made me think about this was the downhill portion. But that's obviously so related to, I got to go up in order to go down. And around here, it's, fairly significant climbs for all of our trails before you get to the downhill. So, I'm not sure if potentially, like, because I've gotten more efficient with the uphill and from a skill perspective, that it's made it easier, or that, as the season progresses, your fitness is improved, and just general familiarity also helps with that. So it's kind of a mix.
Well, the big jumps in skill progression is interesting, and I've never necessarily studied that. You're both familiar with the concept of deliberate practice, right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. And so I don't know if have you ever done any deliberate practice, Charlie, for your downhill stuff, where you've found one course and repeated it, and worked, or had gone down some kind of technical thing, stopped, walked your bike back up, and did it again? That would be technical practice.
No, not for mountain biking, because really, I do mountain biking for fun. I'm not racing, so I don't do any deliberate practice related to a specific kind of feature or something like that. I've certainly done some reading on it, which is assisted, like just conceptually, but usually, I go up to have fun on the down, and so that's what I do. I'm having fun. I'm not necessarily deliberately practicing specific skill sets or feature skills.
You've never taken a course or gone on YouTube for high level downhill mountain biking tips or technique tips?
Yeah, a little bit. That's what I'm saying. Like, I have a mountain biking book, which has actually been fairly helpful in terms of like body positioning on, particular kinds of features or jumps or tight turns, whatever the case may be.
I know my experience that it's much easier to train fitness than it is technical skill. And often I'll see athletes who need to work on their technique who defer to training for fitness, thinking that their technique will come along with their fitness. And this isn't always the case. Myself, I kind of fall into that because I'm such a grinder and such a terrible athlete. So I think if I get more fit, I'll be able to do better technique. And what I should be doing is less time in the gym and more time out there doing the sport and learning the technique. What's interesting about mountain biking, there's a lab rat of mine, a good friend in Jackson, and he was training for a 100-mile mountain bike race. So I designed a program for him, and it was a series of loops over on Grand Targhee there on the Wyoming side, but on the western side of the Tetons. And this was a pretty terrible program in terms of I felt sorry for him. He would do, uphill interval sprints. I think at the top of the cycle, he was doing 70 miles, getting ready for his 100-mile race. And what he found and has reported back, and this is a few years ago, is that even now, the result of that program, whatever it was, really leveled up his overall riding. And not only the fitness, but also the skill element. But it seems to me what he talks about mostly is the fitness element. And even from season to season. So he'll come into the mountain bike season in the spring, and even though he's not necessarily fit, after doing that program, he'll be able to perform better early season mountain biking than he had, in previous years. And I wonder about this, and this might be something for Kelson to talk about in terms of his experience, is that by doing the program, not only, I don't know if his fitness certainly improved, but maybe what really improved was he got through a mental block about how hard he could push himself. And and now he kind of knows he has this bigger capacity that he can handle it, and that has transferred to his mountain bike performance. That's right in your wheelhouse there on SF side, Kelson. Any thoughts about that idea that you kind of get pushed physically, and it kind of opens up the avenue for what you can actually do?
Yeah, I think it has two different ways to go about it. One is I think once your fitness is good enough and you aren't really taxed physically, sometimes you can potentially drift into what's called a flow state, which I think to be in a flow state is like you want to be in that 60 to 80% max heart rate zone, to where you're just you're being very efficient with your movements. It's kind of just everything's working correctly, which maybe that is a potential for Charlie as well. Maybe he's hitting some kind of flow state on the downhill piece. But kind of like what you were talking about, Rob, is I've been through some fairly significant grinds, like multi-day type physical fitness type activities, and I think maybe there's two types of people. I'm similar to you, to where like I'll just keep trudging along and stop thinking about it, to where maybe there I need to stop doing what I'm doing and focus on some technique. But yeah, I think it's just you have to get to a point to where your fitness isn't even a question, and you can just think what you're doing. Does that make sense?
Well, it does on one hand, but you can reach flow state in activities that have nothing to do with fitness, like playing a piano or curling or playing chess. It's interesting. I know that Charlie had found that in his research, his heart rate. But I mean, it'd be interesting to see. I guess he's going to try to measure what his downhill heart rate is. I wonder if what is flow state? Is that where you're demonstrating the increase in performance, or is that when you're doing deliberate practice? Deliberate practice definitely isn't flow state, right? Those are two interesting, I think, different things. I think the result of deliberate practice could be a flow state where everything's working well for you technically, and it seems easy. The field is, I was thinking about this for Charlie and his downhill mountain biking. I haven't done a lot of that, but I've definitely eaten shit a few times. And there was one summer when I ended up doing quite a bit of it for me. And at the end of summer, the downhill, I was going faster, but things were coming at me slower just because of my. Do you know where I left off? Tell me where I left off there.
Flow state.
Flow state. Yeah.
Okay. I guess in terms of flow state, you can get into a flow state. Flow state is all about application of technical skill, but in such a way that you really don't have to think about it. It just kind of flows naturally, and it seems easy, even though you're performing at a high level. And I saw Charlie's research in terms of where optimal heart rate is to reach flow state, but you can reach flow state in activities that have nothing to do with fitness, like playing a piano or curling or, anything. And so I think that flow state is some element of technical skill rather than fitness, although they could be related. Your idea there that I think what you had said, Kelson, in terms of this idea that certainly you cannot perform well if you're over fatigued or you're doing panic breathing. So there is a certain level of fitness that you need to be able to do that kind of deliberate practice, such that you can take and improve your skill development. But I'm just always careful to not conflate the two too significantly. I mean, the idea is you want to have enough level of fitness so that you can do the deliberate practice to increase your skill. Ideally, that's the ideal from our perspective.
Yeah, I wonder, it'd be interesting. You mentioned, so let me rewind. I had done a bit of research on flow state stuff for this article. And, I mean, it's, I think it's definitely a thing, but it's kind of squishy, like there's a physical component of it. And that seems to be fairly well researched. But, I can be in zone 2 to zone 3 and have a completely terrible session, right? Bad application of those skills. So, there's quite a bit of like sports psychology involved with that. So I was trying to narrow it down to just hey, let's focus on fitness, skill development, and skill application. And, perhaps if there's ways to shorten the journey from skill development to skill application. I would be kind of curious to see, you mentioned, musicians can enter flow state. Anybody can doing whatever. I think I've been there when I'm writing an article. I'd be kind of curious to see if there's any research on that from a physical component. Does a musician who enters the flow state and is ripping on stage, what's their body doing? They're obviously not super high output from a physical requirement standpoint, but there might be something going on from a physiological perspective that they're still entering that zone 2 to zone 3. Maybe, I don't know.
I think we need to be careful in focusing on flow state. I think we should pivot to what type of fitness is required to be able to do deliberate practice for skill development. Because like you said, a professional athlete is going to perform at a high level, but I don't think they reach flow state every time, right? It's relatively rare. But they still are performing at a high level, even though they may have to think about it more than they would if they were just gliding along. That's an interesting question, though, is what level of fitness is required to do deliberate practice and improve your technique. It's upon the athlete to do that deliberate practice, but from our perspective, what level of fitness is required. And of course, that's going to change from sport to sport and activity to activity.
Yep. I'm curious if you guys, not necessarily using flow state, but have you guys experienced like a session in a sport where you made a jump and it was like a noticeable, like, holy shit, like I've never done this as well as I did right now before?
I don't know if it's ever been as like pronounced as what you're describing. A couple of years ago, when I had like frequent access to a climbing gym, like I was there for about 7 weeks straight, and that's where I had the most like consistent practice. And I kind of think that consistent practice plays into your increasing your ability. So I don't know if that was the reason, but I made considerable jumps in my in my bouldering game. But, and I think it was around week 3 or 4 is when I noticed that, just going up a couple grades. But I think that was probably the only time I was like, this is something's working here, but I think it was through consistency.
Did you, how did you approach the training? Since it sounds like that was a fairly dedicated 7-week training block for you. Was there any kind of approach?
No, there not specifically. I think I climbed 4 times a week or so. And that was like that very deliberate practice. I was still doing other type of training, but it wasn't geared towards like climbing. It was just general fitness.
Yeah.
So,
what about you, Rob?
Yeah, I can't think of a great technical jump. It's always been hard. I had to. It's always been small increments for me. I think just a lot of work that's put in, and I wonder how often those occur in different types of athletics. A big significant skill jump. Is it like your deliberate practice on the smaller skills, or let's say you are practice on one type of skill and you finally master it, and then all of a sudden, because you've mastered that, now a whole new world of skills have opened for you. That's just kind of like for example, learn to do the kip in gymnastics. Once you can get the kip, consistently, then you can start doing, horizontal bar work. And maybe you'll improve there, but that'd be another interesting way to take a look at it. And there'd be some really significant, I think, in-depth, specific sport research to figure that out. It may have already been done. I just haven't seen it.
Yeah, I would imagine it is similar to strength and conditioning training, right? Relative to training age. So you have young training age, you're going to make these very large, noticeable jumps in short periods of time in terms of fitness. But as your training age continues and you stay consistent with your training, those jumps become smaller and smaller, right? I would imagine it's the same thing in terms of skill development. I mean, you think back to if you got somebody who works a very high level skier who focuses on moguls, they're fighting for fractions of a second in terms of improvement. Whereas for me, it'd be like, the difference between falling a mile down a ski hill and then actually completing it and then actually completing it smoothly. Those jumps are going to be more significant for me compared to a high level skier.
Hey, Charlie, are you riding with someone that's better than you?
No, I usually ride alone. Every now and then I'll have somebody with me. I've definitely found when I do ride with somebody, that can be super helpful, particularly if it's somebody better. Because you can follow their line, right? And that's like certainly part of the deal is like identifying angles on features and how you approach it. So if I'm following somebody who's better than me, I can see how they're approaching a feature and the line they're taking, which is probably going to be better than what mine would be.
It's such an interesting idea. Like in skiing, so many people, alpine skiing get stuck in just being an average skier, and few take do the leap to become, that skill level for a much better skier. And I think that the reason is because it's fairly easy to become a average skier, but taking the next step to become advanced, I mean, that takes a lot of work and deliberate practice. The steps come slower, and that's certainly what I've seen in my program with the works the athletes I've worked with. Is that you're right. When you first start, you're able to improve significantly fast, but then you plateau, and you got to grind away at that plateau for a while. Deliberate practice, and then all of a sudden you get it, and then you kind of make another step, and then you plateau again. Have you guys experienced that plateau again and again in different sports that you've done?
Yeah, definitely. Like I can say it with my jiu-jitsu stuff. I mean, I think jiu-jitsu for me at this point is the sport that I've done the longest in my life. And so as a frame of reference, I've like 8 or 9 years there, and yeah, it's the same kind of deal. Like I'll be relatively stagnant in terms of like my skill development, at least the application of skill development. And then all of a sudden I'm like doing things during a live sparring session that, I didn't realize that I could do in a live sparring session. So I've definitely seen that.
But in your jiu-jitsu training, I mean, I'm not too sure how it works, but or how you practice it, but is the first part of every session working on some specific skill, and then you spar at the end, or how does that work?
Traditionally, yeah. I'd say for like the last 4 years, I just spar.
Got it.
And that's just because I've got like a solid group of experienced guys that I train with, and everybody's got, quite a few years under their belt and that kind of stuff. So we just get the sparring in. Everybody kind of does their own research in terms of, looking at YouTube videos, whatever the case may be, on specific techniques. But then, the way I approach it is I'll just kind of send it on a certain technique and see if it works during a live session. That might not be the right approach. It's certainly the most fun approach. But in terms of like plateauing to a skill jump, I've certainly felt that with grappling.
Well, getting back to what we can control from our perspective on the fitness side, how do we identify I guess for us, there's 2 components to it. Identify the major fitness demands of each sport or activity, develop the programming and exercises specific to that activity, to those demands, and then identify a minimum level of fitness that you need to attain, to either begin the preseason or, do deliberate practice. So in our programming right now, we've done the first 2 fairly well, but the minimum level of fitness that you need to have for that specific event, we don't necessarily have that. What I mean by that is our dryland ski training program, for example, a pre-season ski training program. There's not a fitness assessment as part of it. We've identified the fitness demands, and then this exercises that focus on those demands, and we start relatively easy and progress through the cycle. And at the top of the cycle, you're definitely more fit and hopefully more sport specific fit than you were when you started. I guess taking back, I do have in my mind some ideas of what that should be. For example, being able to do 6 or 7 full leg blasters with a 30-second rest between. For alpine skiing, in my mind, is where the top of the progression is, or something close to that. And maybe that's my mind of where now your level of eccentric strength for downhill skiing needs to be to get to the season early and start practicing right away. But I've never formally, measured that, and I kind of wonder how we would measure that. It's not like we could take someone in the middle of the season, a bunch of skiers, and give them a fitness assessment, maybe on the exercises that we do, to say, this is the standard you need to be at, because they're at the middle of the season. And can we test athletes at the beginning of the season? Definitely not free ski athletes, because it's rare to find, free ski athletes who approach the season differently. and mountain athletes also, like, Kelson is a multi-sport mountain athlete, right? So he's going to be climbing and running and maybe doing some hunting, and then ski season is going to be here before he knows, and he'll do a few weeks training for back into ski season, and then he'll move into that. But it's not like that's his focus. Perhaps on the mountain world, the only way we could do that would be to test like U.S. ski team members or junior ski team members right before their season started. But again, that would just be an element of where their coaches got them. That's such a difficult thing to identify there, of what the minimum needs to be able to do deliberate practice, the minimum level of fitness. And I guess that also depends on where your level of technical skill is, right? So if you're doing a basic skill as a novice in the sport, maybe your level of fitness doesn't need to be as advanced as you would be to do a much more difficult skill. And taking it back to rock climbing, there's a great example where the level of fitness to take a climber from V1 to V4 bouldering problems isn't nearly as high as it is to take an experienced climber from V7 to V8 or whatever. The level of fitness there is much more high because the holes are so much smaller. Anyway, I don't mean to ramble, but it's complicated. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. So like some of the big three things that we identified in terms of like what we could potentially do with this. So one, what Rob was just going over, like what level of baseline fitness is required to efficiently practice technical skills. And so that's like your preseason, right? So I want to go preseason. I want to prepare as best as I can in what is likely going to be an artificial environment, right? Because it's hard to, I can't duplicate big rock climbing in a gym. It's just different, right? Same for biking, same for skiing. So what's the baseline fitness to enter the season, identifying traits or ranges associated with conditioning or strength or whatever the case may be. Second, simple measures related to your physiology that you can execute skill development, right? So that's like me at the top of the hill, right? I already did my climb and I want to focus on technical skill development on my downhill. Like, where does my body need to be? Does my body need to be in a specific heart range? How do I control for environmental factors? Are there rules that we can set up for that to control for those? And so on and so forth. And then I think third is potentially finding, this is what I'd probably be the hardest, but finding a system of measurement to indicate a good technical run versus a bad technical run. So for biking, that might be a little bit simple, right? If I am doing repeats on the same trail, speed down the hill is going to be a good indicator. But I'm kind of curious to see, like, if I'm approaching with skill development in mind, if I'm approaching a feature that I'm not particularly confident on, what was my body doing when I did it well, that individual feature, and what was my body doing when I did it poorly, right? Was there a physiological difference there in terms of as I approached that feature? So those are kind of my overarching questions. I don't know if, I don't know what these will result in, if we'll be able to find kind of the details in this, but it'll be interesting to investigate for sure.
I do know that I think maybe the best example, the most recent example I heard is Michaela Schifrin and how much, like she's, if I understand correctly, she's really dedicated to her fitness, but also her sleep, right? She tries to take a nap every day and decrease stress and stuff. And that, so that's an athlete who's taking a look at the other elements instead of fitness in terms of their, on the mountain performance. So there's so much that goes into it. I was just looking at some of our plans, and I guess I do have some gates or end of cycle gates for most of our sport specific plans. Like how many thousands of step ups you need to be able to do at the end of the cycle before attempting Denali. And there's a sled drag element to that too. So I guess I do have those. And based on our athlete feedback, the plans do a good job of preparing athletes for the fitness demands. But they're based more on my craft of coaching and also, the specific fitness demands of a climb. For example, if I get an athlete, an athlete, I've done a plan for a Colorado Grand Traverse, and as part of that, it's a ski mountaineering event. As part of that, I took a hard look at what exactly the event was, and in that, it's not a lot of vertical climbing. It's mostly long distance skinning. But the plan reflects that the specific demands of that event. But it's more difficult for an entire sport like kayaking or mountain biking. I guess I'll shut up and let you guys talk.
No, anything to add on that, Kelson?
No, I guess I'm kind of curious to see like what the next step is for this, Charlie. Like as far as like hooking up cameras and heart rate monitors, or what's your idea for that?
Yeah, so kind of the first, I'm going to do a trial run of essentially there's some off-the-shelf features where you can integrate your fitness data from, let's say, a Garmin tracker with GoPro video. So it'll sync up so that you have a real-time overlay of like all of the fitness metric data feedback you get from the Garmin as you're doing the sport. So I'm going to take a GoPro and take a Garmin and do a couple runs of this and do the overlay of the fitness data. And it'll be kind of interesting to see performance. That's kind of the quantitative, right? Like we'll get that data and that will be accurate. There's going to be a kind of challenging qualitative component to this. Is like, what's good? What's a good run? What's a bad run? Maybe that might just be as simple as controlling for speed on a known route. But oftentimes, like so much of it is just based on feel, right? Like you kind of know when you hit a turn well, when you hit a jump well. So I'm going to mess around with that. Do a couple runs. I'm going to do some on enduro riding and some on downhill biking. We haven't done much on downhill biking before, so that'll just be kind of an interesting research effort. But yeah, being able to see what your body's doing before, during, and after, and see if there's something that we can't take away from that in order to kind of improve or establish some rules on like where you want your body to be in order to execute skill development most efficiently. And then the second component that I'm hoping will come from this data is an advancement of some of the preseason and pre-event fitness gates, like Rob was just mentioning. Like they might be totally right, but there might be room for improvement too there. So much of the event specific programming is based off of, let's say on the mountainside, the geographic features, elevation gain, distance, etc. Is there something we can do to narrow that down a little bit more and make it a better system? And just the integration of wearable tech. I mean, I think most folks who do our program, we ran a survey on this, and there's quite a high percentage of folks who do our programming that utilize fitness trackers of some variety. And so that might be a tool we can utilize in our fitness programming, maybe not. Or it could be just a tool to say, hey, this is where you want to be based off of your training priority, right? Are you at the climbing gym to develop skill? Are you there to have fun? Are you there as a kind of a recovery effort, but still want to maintain fitness, all that stuff? And there might be physiological data that we can prescribe based on their baseline metrics to most efficiently enter whatever the training priority is.
I'm just trying to think in my mind about the qualitative element of that and how we would design a study for that. And so, for example, maybe the assessment will be a high-level downhill mountain biking run at a resort, and you'll only take, if you do this run again and again and again, part of your improvement, and I guess the assessment would be your time down the hill, right? Because if you're flowing well and you're making the jumps and everything, the turns correctly, your speed down the hill should improve. So your speed down this route should improve. So that would be the assessment. But if you did the route again and again and again, you would get familiar with it. So maybe part of your improvement wasn't necessarily skill improvement, but just familiarity with the route. In other words, you can anticipate when the turn was coming, and so you knew it was coming, and so you would be ready for it rather than knowing rather than being better at turning. And so if we did it where we took and had different routes that you did the test on, the routes would have to be comparable somehow. And I'm sure there's Charlie, is there some kind of rating system for downhill mountain biking routes?
Yeah, same as skiing.
So it would have to be maybe another double black diamond, downhill and mountain biking route. But even that is somewhat subjective based on the route setter in terms of how they rate it. And I would assume that if you went in downhill mountain bike, like Kelson's example of rock climbing earlier, if you went in downhill mountain bike 7 days in a row, you would be faster on day 7 than you would be on day 1, just because you're more familiar with it and you've done some focused practice. It's just so hard to assess what that would be from the physical components. My assumption would be not only would you be getting down the hill faster from a skill proponent, but because your skill is higher, your fitness demands would be lower. So in other words, you'd be going faster, but the measured fitness would be lower because you wouldn't be expending as much energy doing the technical skills because your skill had improved. It's just really. Go ahead.
No, yeah. I mean, that's it's kind of challenging. It's kind of a challenging question. I think that's like a good example of skill application, right? Would be the speed down a route. Now, the other question is what is that going to be much different than skill development, right? So with skill development, I need to get reps. In order to get reps, it's going to be different from a output perspective, right? Hypothetically, I probably want a lower heart rate as I'm getting more reps. One, that's going to hypothetically enable better practice reps. But two, I want to maximize the number of reps I get in a day, right? So let's say I have a day to bike. I probably want to lower my output to some degree in order to extend my training session. So are there rules we can set for that? How do we measure that? All that kind of stuff. I think it's kind of the interesting questions.
Well, it's more than just reps. Deliberate practice is more than just reps. I've certainly been a victim of just doing reps and not getting any better at many things. But I think the second idea you had is interesting. In other words, certainly if you want to improve your downhill mountain biking skill, then you want to minimize your fatigue before you start going downhill. So ideally, you're going to go to a resort and ride up the lift, so you don't got to pedal up. That'll get you more reps for one thing, but it's interesting to kind of see if you do as you pay attention, if you do like 3 or 4 runs and then your 5th one's sloppy as shit. And so now I'm going to break the day up where I'm only going to do 3 runs, take a break, 3 runs, take a break, rather than pushing it to improve. That's just an interesting element, because if you're really doing deliberate practice, it is mentally taxing. We know that for sure. And the books on deliberate practice say you can only do it for an hour and a half to 2 hours a day, right? Because it's so mentally taxing because you're really focusing. I know that in our work with Range Fitness, for example, we found that we there were times when we tried to go to the range like every day of the week, and we were just, because it's Range Fitness protocol that we developed is pure deliberate practice. But even after 3 or 4 days, we were just exhausted mentally. We didn't want to go to the range. We just didn't mentally, or just fried. I mean, there's so many things to think about, but that would be interesting, right there to see, if you really want to improve your downhill mountain biking, you want to do 3 runs and take a break, or something like that. Right. That'd be some valuable data or beta right there.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And like continuing on that, I'll go back to the mountain biking example. When I don't go to downhill parks very often, but when I do, I have to get a certain number of warm-up reps before I start riding well, which is interesting because usually in comparison to when I'm doing like an enduro ride, like going up to go down, I don't necessarily need that. So there's obviously just a basic kind of, warming the body up and physiologically and from a sport perspective. Is there, maybe there's some rules that can be established there to enter that primed zone based. This is all going to be like crazy sport specific. It's going to be different from sport to sport, I think. But are there some rules we can go into there? And I think the marksmanship range fitness stuff for shooting would be probably the easiest one to execute this with, just because you get that automatic target feedback, right? Like, whether you're hitting or not. So I think it could potentially extend to some shooting as well.
Yeah, just definitely interesting. I wonder how much of this is athlete specific. So ideally in the study, we would, have 5 of you guys doing this and we need some type of assessment to see what application worked best. For example, maybe one guy trained or did, 10 downhill mountain bike runs a day, 5 days in a row. And the other guy did 10, 2 days, took day 3 off, and then 10, 2 days. Another guy did 3 break. Anyway, it'd be interesting to see, how that would all break down. I just wonder how much of it is individualized. It may not be. I mean, on the fitness, that's the good thing about fitness in terms of the fitness demands, is they're not individualized. The fitness demands of the event or the sport are dictated, and that's how come most of MTI programming doesn't cater to the athlete. It caters to the specific fitness demands of the sport or the event. But the technical improvement, I wonder how much of that is individualized. Have you seen that at all, Kelson? Technical skill development that's been really individualized, and how quick people progress given the same training protocol?
Yes. That's kind of hard to answer. Technical skill. I mean, I think most of the time I've always functioned on like a general fitness demand from my time in the military. So, man, I guess the only. Sorry, go ahead.
Maybe an example would be where your platoon or something went to a school, doing CQB shoot house stuff, and there was, a certain assessment or standard they had to meet at the end. And because they're all receiving the same training, right, specific training protocol, if they had differences in terms of the standard at the end, I'm sure there were some differences. They probably all had to make the standard. But that almost means that what skill you came into the school with would dictate maybe how much you would gain from it too, right? If you came in more skilled, you might get more from the programming than if you came in less skilled. It's complicated. I think to do this, you'd almost have to take people who are unfamiliar with the activity, put them into it, and then see if there were differences in skill development given the same training, skill training protocol, and try to identify what those differences would be for the individual. I don't know. I guess what I'm getting at is, are there is it individualized in terms of the best way to train skill development?
I think so. There's usually a baseline of knowledge from what I've seen, but like we'll just say combat shooting, for example, we'll all go through the same like combat shooting curriculum, but there's always going to be guys that practice a little bit more, do a little more dry firing, and kind of fine tune their kit a little bit more, who typically become the best shooters. So I think maybe there's a motivation aspect to it as well. But I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think, I think it depends.
In what I've read about deliberate practice, I haven't seen much written on this idea of the best way to individualize it, or if it is individualized, and how you would determine what would work best for you as an individual, what test you decide to figure out what the application would be. Have you read anything about that element of deliberate practice, Charlie? Or it seems like all the data is hour and a half a day and really focused, but
no, I didn't dive too deep into deliberate practice physiology. What I know about is kind of what you've mentioned already. But it certainly could be something, maybe that's something we can contribute to. I think you're right. This would have to be pretty seriously individualized, and then by sport, and then by individual. But it would be interesting, like the baseline gates, like, based on height, weight, age, you need to be able to do X amount of work in X amount of minutes with X amount of with an X amount of heart rate. That tells you that you're primed from a preseason perspective going into it, and then being able to identify potentially, where you need your body to be in order to best employ deliberate practice and skill development.
I'm just trying to think how this study would work for the deliberate practice element. So let's say we every athlete coming into the skill part did the same training protocol, and at the end they all had really similar assessment results or whatever we assess that on a fitness perspective. Now we break them up into 3 groups. They all receive the same training, skill-based training, but maybe one group does it early in the morning, one group does it at midday, one group does it, late at night. And then at the end to see if there's a difference in terms of how much each group improved in their skill development. That could be based on time of day. You could also do it based on temperature. I mean, there's so many different ways you could take this. It's really, it can get, in my mind, it's getting more and more complicated. It always starts out complicated, of course, but.
Yeah. This definitely requires some breaking down. I think more than likely, if we get some traction on this, it will be an extended series of studies, trying to kind of piece together individual parts of it, because there are so many variables associated with it. We didn't even talk about equipment, right? Equipment is going to, if your mountain bike is better than my mountain bike, I'm going to be climbing slower. I'm going to be working harder. That's another variable that we have to control for. Or a certain bike just rides better downhill, based on the terrain, tires, etc. So there's a lot to it for sure. But I think it could be interesting. First step is just doing some testing on this data collection, and see what the demands are. And then I think once we are able to discover what those demands are, we can start to piece this together.
I guess anybody who's listening to this, if you have any personal experience in terms of skill improvement where you've noticed a difference in how you practiced and you've seen better improvement one way you practice rather than another, whether that be time of day, number of reps per day, time you do deliberate practice during the day, how often you do it. Please send me or Charlie or Kelson a note. It'd be interesting to see the experiences out there. I do know that on the fitness side, we always start more complicated than it needs to be, and then we kind of get more and more simple and focused as we learn. And the best example comes to mind for me is the downhill skiing and what I call leg lactate tolerance. It's just to train your legs to be able to take lactate and then recover from them relatively quickly, which is an element of downhill skiing. And when I first designed those cycles, we had pretty complicated circuits that we put athletes through, much of different exercises. It was just too complicated. And right now we just use one exercise and a simple interval program, and it does a great job of doing it. It's just got much more simple, much more focused, and that's hopefully what we'll be able to find out with this study on skill development.
Yep, for sure. Cool. Any other notes, fellas? All right, we'll leave it there. Yeah, if you got some experience with this, email us, coach@mtmtactical.com. We're all ears. Thanks for listening in.